Prayer for abundance in the home. A quiet table, the grain of wood catching the light, the soft breath of a candle, and the sense, almost physical, that someone has been working here for your good. Let your eyes rest on that simple scene within you. A loaf still warm, a square of carpenter's metal, a place set for those you love. This is where abundance begins, not in noise or display, but in a home that remembers it is seen by God. If your chest has carried a knot these days, bills on the counter, conversations that end in silence, the fridge that feels emptier than your courage, know this: you are not alone, you are not failing, and what you carry matters. I see you. More importantly, the Lord sees you, and St. Joseph, the silent guardian, stands near the doorframe of your life with a patience that does not run out. There are seasons in a family when scarcity is not just about money. It is the thinness of patience, the brittle tone at the end of a long day, the ache that wakes you at night and whispers that nothing will change. Scarcity, when it seeps into the heart, shrinks what is possible and makes every room feel smaller even when nothing has moved. And yet the gospel insists, quietly, persistently, that the Father knows what we need before we ask, that daily bread is not a metaphor for later, but a promise for today. Abundance in this way of faith is not the luxury of more. It is the rightness of enough, the steady rhythm of peace, order, honest work, unity, and bread on the table. In the school of St. Joseph, we learn to trust in divine providence, not as a vague hope, but as a way of living that changes the air we breathe. You have tried to hold everything together, and your nervous system knows it. The shoulders rise, the jaw tightens, the breath grows shallow, and the mind loops through the same corridors of worry. When stress repeats, the brain builds quick pathways toward alarm and the body follows. The Lord does not shame the body for this. He meets it. When the heart learns a calmer rhythm, the mind remembers possibilities. When the breath slows, the amygdala's siren dims. When a safe ritual is repeated, the nervous system gathers itself and dares to trust. This is why a small prayer at the same hour, a shared meal without screens, a candle lit with intention can feel like medicine. Spiritual practices are not escape hatches from reality. They are the careful carpentry of grace, joining what is fractured, sanding what is rough, setting braces where the structure needs to hold. St. Joseph worked in wood, and wood remembers hands. He knew how to measure twice and cut once. He knew that haste wastes material, that patience saves a household money, and that the beauty of a piece lies in what you cannot immediately see, the hidden joints, the faithful angles, the line that stays true. In your home, abundance grows like that, quietly in what is repeated with love, in choices that may not glitter but keep you upright. With St. Joseph, every work becomes a prayer. The commute that pays the rent, the soup stretched to serve one more bowl, the text sent to make peace after a hard word. Providence is not fireworks. It is a presence that holds, a daily fidelity that tastes like fresh bread when you thought there would not be enough. Everything in your life has taught you to brace for impact, to clench before the shoe drops, to expect that love will ask too much and give too little. This is what fear does. It narrows the eyes, it shortens the breath, it steals color from the day. Grace does the opposite. Grace expands the gaze, lengthens the breath, and returns color. Sometimes so softly you only notice at dinner when laughter comes back for a moment, and you wonder how it found its way home. If shame has been your background noise, about money, about choices, about words spoken in fatigue, let it be known, shame is not from God. Truth is from God. Order is from God, justice is from God, and the steady kindness that helps you try again tomorrow is from God. Hard truths can be healing when they arrive with compassion, and tonight, compassion leads. Feel the ground beneath your feet, and the place where your back meets the chair. Let your shoulders drop the width of a breath. Your body is not the enemy of prayer, it is the doorway. As your breath deepens, picture the workshop in Nazareth. Not perfect, not spared from splinters, not free from the need to begin again, yet filled with a presence that reassures without words. Joseph did not perform miracles with his hands. He honored the ordinary until it held the sacred. The neural pathways of your home are shaped by what is repeated. Speak blessing out loud once a day, and your children will memorize the melody of being safe. Clear one small surface each evening, and the mind learns that chaos does not have the final say. Light a candle before you cook, and your body will associate nourishment with prayer. These are not tricks. They are sacraments of the everyday, signs that point beyond themselves to the God who provides. Perhaps you have asked with more honesty than you admit, where is God when the account is low, when the search for work stretches on, when those I love do not speak kindly? The answer is not a slogan, it is a presence. God is near in the person who listens, in the neighbor who shares, in the clarity to say no to what drains and yes to what truly feeds, in the courage to seek help and in the quiet ideas that arrive when you stop arguing with yourself for a moment and start listening. Joseph's silence is an invitation to listen to the heart of God. Silence here is not emptiness. It is the interior space where wisdom can be heard, where plans can be shaped, where waste can be named, where forgiveness can start. The quiet is not the absence of solutions. It is the workshop where solutions are fashioned. You may have learned to equate abundance with sudden windfalls or dramatic rescues. Sometimes God does act with surprise, but often he acts like a craftsman, line upon line, precept upon precept, cut after careful cut. The transformation you long for may not look like a headline. It may look like a budget that finally tells the truth, like a reconciled conversation after years of speaking around the wound, like a habit broken and a habit begun. Destiny can turn on a small hinge when that hinge is obedience. Joseph knew this. He rose when the angel spoke. He moved when danger came. He built again when the map changed. There is a strength in you that has not been used up yet. There is a clarity you have not lost. There is bread enough for today, and grace enough for the next right step. Consider how your home feels in the first minutes of morning and the last minutes of night. These are sacred thresholds. What you repeat at thresholds becomes the climate of a family. A single sentence spoken with faith, St. Joseph, silent guardian, intercede for us, can become a beam that holds a roof. A small act of order can become a pathway the mind trusts. A single choice to bless rather than to bite can interrupt a generational pattern the brain learned without your consent. Emotional neuroscience calls it neuroplasticity. The saints call it conversion. Families call it relief. Whatever the name, it is God's mercy moving through ordinary means, and it is available to you now. Let your heart rest for a moment in the thought that you do not have to build this alone. Providence is not an idea you must force yourself to believe. It is a hand on your shoulder that steadies you while you measure and mark and try again. If tears come, let them come. If a long breath finds you, welcome it. If a memory of a better time arrives, do not push it away. Healing often begins when the body finally exhales, when the soul admits its need, when the home says out loud that it is ready for another way. With St. Joseph, every work becomes a prayer, and every prayer can become a plan. This hour is a shelter for you. The door is open, the candle is lit, and the table is set. The one who provides is already here. As you listen, allow a simple intention to rise, one concrete need, one place of worry, one relationship that aches, and place it gently in the care of the carpenter who kept bread on the table for Jesus and Mary. He knows how to build again. He knows how to guard what is entrusted. He knows how to ask the Father for what a family requires. In the school of St. Joseph, we learn to trust in divine providence, not someday, but now. Before numbers and plans, there is a climate in the house, almost imperceptible at first, like a change in weather that you only notice when the windows start to fog. It shows up in the voice that tightens at the end of the day, in the glance that turns away before meeting another's eyes, in the drawer that stays cluttered, because there is no courage left for small decisions. Scarcity often lives here, not only in the bank account but in the nervous system, training the body to expect less, even when love wants to give more. The soul knows this climate. It feels the temperature drop when hope thins, and it knows the warmth that returns when trust is allowed a chair at the table again. There is a pattern the mind rehearses when fear moves in. Future catastrophes parade as if they were already facts. Old sentences from childhood repeat with the authority of truth, and attention narrows until only problems remain in view. The brain, trying to protect, builds grooves where worry runs fast, and the body follows with a shallower breath, a quicker pulse, a jaw that holds all the words not spoken. None of this means failure. It means a heart has tried to keep the house standing with limited light. Emotional neuroscience names the pathways and explains the loops. The gospel names the giver who knows what is needed before a request is formed, and who meets the body where it is rather than where it should have been. Abundance, in the language of faith, does not shout. It arrives like steady light through a small window, landing on a table where bread is enough and peace is possible. It looks like relationships that repair after frictions, like work that dignifies rather than consumes, like order that supports rather than controls. It is not spectacle, it is presence. It is the quiet assurance that the Father sees, that grace is already at work in the grain of the wood, in the grain of the day, in the grain of a life that has not given up. In the school of St. Joseph, abundance is the fruit of providence and fidelity, a partnership between divine care and human honesty, between heaven's blessing and earth's patient craft. St. Joseph understood the difference between noise and strength. The Gospels keep his words unrecorded, yet his decisions resound across centuries. The carpenter's square in his hand was not a symbol of perfectionism. it was a promise of alignment. He knew that a true line saves material, that a well-placed brace holds more than a beautiful surface, that the hidden joint is what keeps a family from collapsing in the first wind. There is wisdom in this for anyone who has ever tried to carry a home. The unseen choices shape the visible piece, and the small angles, if kept true, allow the larger structure to rest without strain. When scarcity becomes a narrative, the house begins to echo with it. Meals shrink in conversation before they shrink on plates, laughter rehearses its absence, and the calendar becomes a list of obligations without a single square of Sabbath white. Yet another narrative is possible, one that does not deny limits, but discovers meaning within them. The same room can hold less fear when presence is felt. The same salary can hold more peace when waste loosens its grip. The same history can hold a gentler tone when forgiveness is allowed to speak. This is not denial, it is restoring with God at the center, and with St. Joseph standing in the doorway like a watchman who knows the night and trusts the dawn. The body participates in this new story. A home with calmer rhythms teaches the heart to exhale, and a heart that exhales lets the mind widen its field of vision. The prefrontal cortex begins to lead again, making room for perspective, for creativity, for decisions that prefer the long term to the rush of relief. Rituals that repeat become neural scaffolding, simple, steady, almost invisible, on which larger hopes can rest without breaking. Grace works through such ordinary means, like water shaping stone, not by force, but by faithfulness, and the result is a strength that is quiet, a resilience that does not need to be loud. There are truths that feel hard because they are honest, not because they accuse. Waste consumes more than money. Bitterness costs more than any bill. Secrecy around finances or feelings adds interest that cannot be paid without trust. Compassion does not cancel these truths. Compassion makes them bearable, believable, livable. St. Joseph's presence carries this kind of compassion, the kind that stands beside rather than above, that steadies rather than shames, that points to a path without pretending it requires no courage. Under that gaze, a family remembers that dignity is not earned by success, but received as gift, and that order is not a punishment, but a mercy. In many houses, abundance begins to return the moment naming becomes possible, not a catalogue of failures, not a courtroom of blame, but a reverent naming of what hurts and what matters. Names have power in Scripture because they locate reality. When a fear is called by its name, it becomes something that can be held instead of something that holds everything else. When a longing is spoken aloud, it stops knocking and starts entering. The workshop of Nazareth whispers this wisdom: measured words, patient alignments, choices that honor the grain instead of fighting it. The result is not perfection. The result is integrity, and integrity holds. There is a sentence the heart needs to hear, simple and repeated until it becomes true again from the inside out. You are not alone. You are not unseen. You are not without help. The Father's care does not skip addresses because cash is short, and the intercession of St. Joseph does not tire because days are long. When this truth is allowed to linger, the climate shifts, the windows clear, and the table becomes again what it was meant to be, a place where bread is blessed, where eyes meet without flinching, where tomorrow is not feared as an enemy, but welcomed as a guest. With St. Joseph, every work becomes a prayer, and every prayer, when lived in fidelity, becomes a quiet abundance that a home can feel. There is a difference between plenty and peace, between a full shelf and a full heart, and the soul can tell the difference even when language stumbles. True abundance does not behave like spectacle. It behaves like oxygen, quiet, invisible, essential, returning color to faces and softness to voices that had grown tight from carrying too much for too long. It moves through a house like morning light across a floor, not all at once, but steadily enough that objects regain their contours and people regain their names. In this sense, abundance is not about owning more. It is about being less owned by fear. It is the rightness of enough, the honesty of limits accepted without humiliation, the rediscovery that value is not a price tag, but a presence. St. Joseph understood this economy of Nazareth, where heaven's scale measures by fidelity, not by noise. Consider how the body recognizes this kind of abundance before the mind catches up. Shoulders soften a fraction, breath deepens without permission, and the eyes lift from the narrow corridor of worry to take in the wider room. Emotional neuroscience would speak of parasympathetic tone rising and the amygdala's alarms finding reasons to stand down. Faith would speak of grace settling a house, of providence entering rooms that were already there but felt unreachable. Both are describing the same mercy from different angles. When safety feels possible, the brain becomes a place where perspective can return, and the heart becomes a place where trust can breathe. Abundance, then, has a texture and a temperature. It feels like steadiness. It sounds like voices meeting without flinching. It tastes like bread that is blessed before it is divided. In the scriptures, daily bread is not a poetic flourish. It is an agreement about the pace of God. The Father's generosity arrives in portions that teach reliance rather than panic, relationship rather than hoarding, presence rather than performance. The mind, trained by scarcity, expects the extraordinary. Providence often answers by dignifying the ordinary. A small door opens in the exact place where you feared a wall. A conversation ends without the usual sting. A piece of work, long delayed, finally finds its rhythm. None of this looks impressive on a ledger, yet each moment rebuilds the inner scaffolding on which a family can rest. In the school of St. Joseph, we learn to trust in divine providence, not as wishful thinking, but as the quiet architecture of days that hold. Wood remembers hands, and so does a home. The carpenter's square that Joseph held did not shout about its purpose. It simply demanded alignment. Abundance begins to take shape wherever alignment is honored, where values match choices often enough that the structure does not creak under double weights. When a house says yes to what truly sustains and grows more honest about what only drains, angels have less to repair in the night. Integrity, this meeting of belief and behavior, is the hidden joint that keeps a frame from twisting. The reward is not applause, the reward is rest, the kind of rest that lets love stop bracing for impact and begin trusting that tomorrow will arrive with the same God it carried today. There is also the abundance that reconciles, the kind that goes looking for lost pieces of the heart and returns them without accusation. It does not erase history, but it changes the way memory sits at the table. Where bitterness used to steal attention, tenderness learns to stay. Where secrecy used to knot the stomach, truth learns to speak without theatrical confessions or public trials. The nervous system registers this as relief, micro-reliefs repeated until the body no longer expects ambush around every corner. The saints knew this work of slow mercy, and Joseph, whose recorded words are silence, bears witness to how presence can heal what speeches cannot. With St. Joseph, every work becomes a prayer, and a reconciled sentence spoken in a kitchen late at night is one of the holiest works a family can know. Money in such a vision returns to its rightful place as a servant rather than a master. It pays for roofs and soup and school shoes. It does not dictate dignity. When the soul forgets this, anxiety recruits the imagination into a factory of worst-case scenarios, and waste follows. Waste of sleep, of tenderness, of time that could have belonged to joy. Abundance corrects the order. It teaches that worth is not leased from a number, and that generosity is not postponed until a perfect moment that never comes. The Church's ancient wisdom calls this the destination of goods, the reminder that what we hold is entrusted, not enthroned, and that a portion always carries another's name. This is not subtraction, it is multiplication of meaning, the mysterious arithmetic by which a modest table feeds more than hunger. In homes where this abundance takes root, order stops feeling like punishment and begins to feel like kindness. Drawers open without dread, the calendar admits white space without apology, and mealtimes recover their vocation as meeting places rather than refueling stations. The brain notices and cooperates, rewarding predictability with calm and freeing attention for creativity that had been blocked by constant firefighting. This is how grace and the nervous system become collaborators, habit by habit, rhythm by rhythm. A pattern emerges in which life feels less like a chase and more like a craft. The workshop of Nazareth offers its parable again: measured cuts, patient sanding, finishes that do not need to dazzle because the piece was built to last. Some truths will still arrive with weight because love refuses to flatter where honesty is needed. Waste remains costly, resentment remains corrosive, and avoidance remains a luxury no family can afford for long. Yet compassion stands beside these truths so that they heal rather than harden. Joseph's kind of strength, firm without harshness, decisive without drama, shapes a climate in which accountability feels like care. Under such weather, apologies can land without breaking, budgets can tell the truth without shaming, and plans can include both bread for today and seeds for a season that has not grown yet. This is not idealism, it is sanctity in plain clothes. The language of abundance will repeat until the heart believes it again. You are not alone. You are not unseen. You are not beyond help. Repetition here is not redundancy. It is medicine. Neural pathways thicken with what is rehearsed, and the soul too learns by hearing the same good news in slightly different tones until confidence returns with its suitcase and decides to stay. St. Joseph, silent guardian, intercede for us. Let the phrase circulate like breath in the rooms that have felt stale, not as an order, not as a slogan, but as a companionship that shifts the atmosphere by simply being present. And when this presence fills a house, abundance shows its final shape. Not a life without limits, but a life where limits no longer humiliate. Not a family without history, but a family whose history has begun to bless. Not a home without needs, but a home where needs are named without fear because love has made a vow to remain. The candle on the table ceases to be decor and becomes a sign. The loaf ceases to be only food and becomes sacrament of trust. The square of the carpenter ceases to be a tool and becomes a promise that angles can be kept true. In the school of St. Joseph, abundance looks like this: steady, human, divinely accompanied, and its quiet strength is enough. Silence in a home is more than the absence of noise. It is the presence of a listening that steadies everything else. In the story of St. Joseph, words are scarce, yet decisions are strong. And the workshop tells the tale, the mouth does not. Wood receives the mark of a craftsman who measures before acting, who trusts alignment more than display, who believes that a straight line hidden inside a wall is a kind of mercy. A house shaped by this wisdom does not perform calm. It carries calm in its beams, and even tired voices find themselves speaking at a lower pitch, as if remembering they belong to one another. Bodies understand this quiet before minds explain it. When environments grow gentler, the nervous system loosens its grip on alarm, and that loosening changes everything. Heartbeats begin to space themselves with more trust, breath slides deeper without being chased, and the brain's watchmen, ever faithful, sometimes too vigilant, receive permission to stand down. Emotional neuroscience names this a shift towards safety, parasympathetic tone rising, the prefrontal regions regaining leadership from circuits designed for emergency. Faith names it grace settling in, providence restoring interior weather so that judgments can be sound and choices can be clean. Both vocabularies point to the same relief, a climate where love can think again. Silence of this kind is not passivity, it is readiness. In Scripture, Joseph's quiet does not stall him, it positions him. He hears, he discerns, he moves, and each movement leaves a trace of protection behind. Mary safer, Jesus sheltered, the path ahead clear enough for the next faithful step. The interior hush that precedes such clarity is not empty space, it is a workshop. Thoughts are laid on the bench, motives are weighed, desires are planned until their grain runs true. When the moment to act arrives, there is no scramble for courage, because courage has been curing in the wood. Homes that taste this quiet begin to remember themselves. Arguments still happen, yet they lose their appetite for escalation. Memories still ache, yet they no longer set the speed of the day. Fatigue still knocks, yet it finds a chair rather than a battlefield. The body keeps a record of such changes. Muscles that used to brace for impact soften by degrees, and the mind begins to widen its frame again, noticing possibilities that panic had erased from the blueprint. It is not magic, it is mercy arriving through ordinary doors. Words themselves start to carry different weight when they are born of silence. Decisions about money can be spoken without humiliation, apologies can land without breaking, and the truth, so often a stranger at the table, finds a steady place to sit. Neuroscience would say that the prefrontal cortex is holding the conversation rather than the alarm system. The church would say that prudence is at work, the mother of right choices, clearing a path where love can walk without stumbling. Under St. Joseph's gaze, strength and gentleness stop pretending to be enemies and become the two hands that build the same piece. There is a bond between interior quiet and exterior order that does not reduce life to tidiness. When the inside settles, the outside starts to reflect it, not as a project for display, but as a kindness to hearts that need fewer obstacles on their way to rest. Tables regain their vocation as places of blessing rather than counters for unfinished battles. Entries feel less like checkpoints and more like thresholds, and rooms hold their shape as if remembering that peace has a geometry. Order in this light is not control, it is hospitality to the soul. Prayer grows differently in this atmosphere. It stops auditioning for immediate results and starts consenting to relationship, which is slower and stronger. The ancient petition for daily bread returns to its natural cadence, one day at a time, one meal at a time, one grace at a time, and this cadence begins to teach a nervous system the rhythm of trust. With St. Joseph, every work becomes a prayer, and prayer in turn lends dignity to every humble task, from the late shift that pays for school shoes to the patient listening that keeps love from fraying. Repetition in such a life is not monotony, it is formation. What is rehearsed becomes reliable, and what is reliable becomes restful. The refrain that runs through this hour, St. Joseph, silent guardian, intercede for us, accompanies the day like breath, not as a demand, but as a companionship. The mind learns to follow that line when other lines pull toward panic, and the body, grateful for a trustworthy path, walks it with fewer stumbles. In the school of St. Joseph, we learn to trust in divine providence not as a slogan, but as muscle memory for the soul. Silence, then, is not a retreat from reality. It is the condition for seeing reality whole, not emptiness, but expectant space. Not avoidance, but alignment. Not resignation, but consent to the God who speaks in ways that do not shout. Where this silence settles, abundance begins to take on a voice of its own. The sound of chairs pulled close, of laughter returning in small increments, of doors that open without suspicion. And in that sound, a home recognizes itself again, steady under a presence that does not leave. St. Joseph, silent guardian, intercede for us. There is a certain peace that enters a home when tasks stop arguing with the heart and begin to serve its deepest loves, a steadiness that rises like quiet steam from the simplest chores when they are held within a larger meaning, and the day, which once felt like a queue of demands, starts to sound like a litany with rhythm and breath. In this climate, labor is not a penalty for being alive, but a path through which life organizes itself, a craft that protects dignity because it anchors worth in fidelity rather than in applause or comparison. St. Joseph's workshop offers this atmosphere as a parable, where wood, though resistant, yields to patient hands, and the bench remembers each project not by its glamour, but by the faith that shaped it. Bodies recognize this dignity before minds define it, because the nervous system eases when repetition becomes reliable and purpose becomes visible, and the endless vigilance that scarcity trained begins to retire from stations it should never have had to man alone. Emotional neuroscience describes how predictable sequences calm reactivity by giving the brain patterns to trust, where the prefrontal regions resume leadership from the circuits built for crisis, and attention, no longer hijacked by alarms, can return to craftsmanship. Faith describes the same mercy with different words, calling it providence moving inside ordinary time, blessing the sweep of a floor and the balance of a ledger with the same seriousness given to larger events, and reminding the soul that no honest labor is invisible to the one who keeps count of hares and sparrows. In this vision, work is not redeemed by intensity but by intention, and intention is not noise but alignment, the quiet agreement between what is valued and what is repeated, until the structure of a day carries the weight of what truly matters without splintering under what does not. The square in Joseph's hand becomes a sacrament of such alignment, insisting that angles honor the grain, that a cut made in haste is more costly than a cut made in truth, and that the unseen joint has more to do with a family's peace than any polished surface. Wherever that square is honored, abundance takes on shape, not as excess but as sufficiency, not as spectacle but as stability, a rightness that the heart can rest against. There are houses where effort has been abundant and fruit has felt scarce, and the soul has grown suspicious of promises that fail to touch a paycheck or a pantry. Yet the witness of Nazareth is that meaning compounds interest in places where money may not, and that serenity is not the same as resignation, because it chooses how to be present even when it cannot choose everything that presents itself. The Gospel's daily bread lives here, arriving in portions that train trust rather than panic, teaching reliance that neither flatters laziness nor punishes limits, but builds a realism that has space for hope, because it knows that today is not an orphan and tomorrow is not a threat. With St. Joseph, every work becomes a prayer, not by adding religious decoration to tasks, but by discovering the presence already woven through their fibers. The heart that has been frightened by scarcity often associates labor with fear and fatigue, and the body holds that association in shoulders that carry more than their share, and in a jaw that rehearses arguments even in sleep. Yet something softens when work is treated as relationship rather than as ransom. Relationship dignifies effort because it remembers faces, those who will sit at the table, those who once taught hands how to hold a tool, those who will inherit both habits and hope, so that the mind, which had learned to evaluate days only by exhaustion, begins to weigh them also by communion. Under such arithmetic, small tasks regain their sacramental feel, not because they magically change, but because they finally appear in context, like notes that stop sounding shrill when the melody returns. There is, too, a healing that happens when speech about labor becomes more truthful, when words honor limits without humiliation and strengths without pretense, and when a budget is allowed to be a servant of love rather than a scoreboard of shame. The nervous system responds to this candor with relief, because transparency removes the chronic unpredictability that strains the body more than effort itself, and predictability, quiet, unglamorous, faithful, becomes a medicine for minds that have lived too long in emergency mode. The saints would call this prudence, Clinicians would call it regulation, families call it finally breathing, and the home, grateful for this new weather, begins to echo with voices that do not have to raise themselves in order to be heard. Work that prays is not a special category of tasks reserved for the few. It is an interior stance available to anyone who handles the day with reverence, because reverence is what happens when a soul remembers it is not alone, and companionship alters the weight of whatever is carried. Joseph's silence speaks this companionship without speeches, as if the grain of the wood itself could testify that hands guided by love learn a pressure that is firm without harshness, exact without cruelty, and decisive without drama. And under that pressure, materials become more, not less, themselves. What emerges is not only a finished piece, but a formed heart, and formation, unlike performance, remains when applause is absent and only night lamps are watching. Money, placed within this companionship, returns to the grammar of service rather than sovereignty, because it is asked to support a vocation rather than to substitute for one, and meaning is no longer mortgaged to the next windfall or threatened by the next bill, as if identity were for sale. The tradition names this the universal destination of goods, a phrase that sounds abstract until it stands beside a grocery list, and the quiet joy of sharing, where the same amount of currency can purchase either panic or peace, depending on whether fear or providence is writing the sentences. In such sentences, generosity is not a luxury of surplus, but a posture that multiplies meaning, and households that practice it discover that the heart grows larger when it refuses to hoard what was never meant to be a prison. When labor carries prayer within it, time acquires a different density, as if hours were no longer a ladder one must climb to reach rest, but a field in which rest begins to appear even while tasks remain. Because rest, in this understanding, is not the absence of effort, but the presence of belonging. Belonging steadies attention, and steady attention becomes craftsmanship, and craftsmanship in turn becomes trust, because others can lean on what has been made and on the person who made it, and the nervous system learns day by day that it does not need to live with its hand on the alarm. In the school of St.Joseph, we learn to trust in divine providence, not by avoiding work, but by allowing work to reveal the God who is not absent from any place where love is served. There will still be days that take more than they give, budgets that stretch like old fabric, and conversations that require courage a second time and then a third. Yet even on those days, the bench in Nazareth offers its witness that what is done with love in truth is never lost, because it becomes part of the interior architecture by which a family stands. The finished surface may be simple, the seams may show, and the piece may sit in a corner rather than in a museum, but it will hold, and holding is its vocation. A home built on this kind of labor discovers that abundance is not louder than fear. It is steadier, and steadiness is what children remember when they grow, and what adults return to when they are tired, and what prayers sound like when they finally learn the tone of God. And when a day closes under such a sign, the candle on the table does not need to prove anything, because its flame is enough to tell the truth about light, and the loaf does not need to be large to taste like mercy, and the tools can rest without being hidden as if they were reasons for shame. The presence that sanctified a workshop sanctifies any place where hearts consent to be taught by fidelity, and in that presence, the sentence that has followed this hour finds again its home in the mouth and in the chest. St. Joseph, silent guardian, intercede for us. With St. Joseph, every work becomes a prayer, and when work becomes prayer, a house remembers it was always meant to be a sanctuary. A table waits in every home, sometimes cluttered, sometimes clear, often carrying more than plates and cups, and its surface remembers the stories that have unfolded there, voices rising and softening, hands describing angles of hope and worry, eyes meeting or missing each other by inches. Where scarcity has left its mark, a table can feel like a checkpoint. Where providence enters, the same table begins to breathe like a chest that remembers how to exhale, and bread, even when simple, tastes larger than itself. The soul knows this difference, because chairs pulled close without tension change the temperature of a room, and the wood beneath the elbows becomes a kind of reassurance that belonging is not on probation. There is a tenderness in the way bodies respond to this space when safety is felt. The nervous system, always listening, takes its cues from voices that do not rush, from pauses that do not threaten, from faces that do not wear armor, and the deep wiring that keeps watch for danger loosens its grip. Emotional neuroscience would speak of social engagement systems coming online, of vagal tone strengthening, of mirror neurons echoing calm back and forth until the exchange becomes a rhythm stronger than worry. Faith would say that grace has found a seat and intends to stay, that the quiet sacrament of presence has begun, and that daily bread, requested without drama, is being given in the pace the gospel promised. Tables shaped by this climate become schools of truth that does not humiliate and kindness that does not flatter, places where stories are told without being turned into court cases, and where apologies land like mended stitches rather than like verdicts. In many homes, a small habit, grace spoken aloud, a question that invites rather than interrogates, a moment of silence that honors more than it avoids, begins to lay new tracks in minds that had learned to brace for impact. Repetition here is not performance, it is formation. The same words, the same gestures, the same attention, offered again and again, tell the nervous system that it can choose cooperation over defense, and the soul, grateful for the relief, begins to trust the house it lives in. St. Joseph's presence leans close to this kind of table, not as a guest who needs to be impressed, but as a guardian who understands that a family's strength is built in ordinary rooms at ordinary hours. The workshop and the dining room speak the same language under his gaze: measured effort, honest provision, a fidelity that does not announce itself, yet holds against weather. Bread cut with care resembles wood cut along the grain. Both respect the material, and both teach that abundance is a collaboration between heaven's blessing and human steadiness. In the school of St. Joseph, a table becomes a workbench of communion, where the fragments of the day are assembled into something that can carry weight. Money, in such a setting, stops pretending to be the only topic worth speaking about and returns to its rightful place as a servant of love. Numbers can be named without turning faces into numbers. Priorities can be aligned without turning desires into enemies, and limitations can be admitted without turning dignity into collateral. The amygdala, grateful for the absence of sudden ambush, allows the prefrontal regions to guide the exchange, and prudence, calm, concrete, compassionate, emerges as the tone. The Church has long said that goods carry a destination beyond the self. At the table, this becomes less an idea and more a flavor, as generosity seasons the meal and meaning, not luxury, becomes the richest course. Memory also finds healing here. Stories once told with sharp edges begin to smooth as time is honored instead of erased, and forgiveness starts to sound less like a demand and more like a door that can be opened from the inside. The body marks this shift in small ways. Shoulders that used to interpret any pause as a threat start to recognize that silence can carry blessing, and eyes that used to scan for danger learn to rest on a face without searching for a reason to flinch. With St. Joseph, every work becomes a prayer, and at a table that blesses, every conversation, stumbling, halting, sincere, becomes part of the liturgy by which a house remembers it is loved. There is a Eucharistic echo in this ordinary scene, not as a replacement for the altar, but as a resonance that dignifies kitchens and dining rooms with the same reverent logic. Take, bless, break, share. Bread on a Tuesday carries that echo when hands handle it with gratitude and restraint, when waste loses its glamour, when plenty learns to make room for another plate, and when lack is met not with panic but with attention that looks for what remains possible. The heart, overhearing this echo, enlarges its capacity to remain steady in seasons that do not impress anyone from the outside, and steadiness, more than spectacle, becomes the architecture of hope. The square in Joseph's hand appears again as a quiet parable at the edge of the table, insisting that alignment is merciful. Values that match choices create a geometry safe enough for children to grow and for adults to rest, and this geometry does not require perfection to hold. It requires honesty repeated until it becomes natural. Conversations that used to dodge around the wound begin to walk through it with gentleness. Budgets that used to scold begin to guide with clarity, and plans that used to collapse under their own ambition learn the weight they can carry. The result is not a showcase, the result is a home, and a home that blesses is strong. Repetition serves this blessing without becoming a cage. A phrase that has visited these pages returns because it refuses to become cliché when lived with sincerity. St. Joseph, silent guardian, intercede for us. Spoken at a table before words about the day, whispered after a misunderstanding, shared in a moment of fatigue, it functions like a hand on a shoulder, steadying without controlling, near without crowding. Neural pathways and spiritual pathways both rely on such constancy. They grow with what returns, and what returns with faith grows roots. A house that lives this way discovers a final, gentle paradox. The meal that seemed small satisfies beyond appetite. The conversation that seemed ordinary clears air heavy with months of unspoken things. The evening that seemed unremarkable becomes the memory that holds during harder weather. Abundance, once imagined as something loud and distant, is recognized as something close and quiet, arriving in time with breath and bread. In the school of St. Joseph, the table becomes an altar of the everyday, the place where scarcity loses its script, and where a family learns one meal at a time, that providence has already found their address. Order has a sound that houses recognize before anyone names it, a quiet cadence that steadies rooms and returns gentleness to doorways that had grown narrow from hurry. It is not the stiffness of control or the vanity of perfection. It is the mercy of alignment. The soul hears that mercy when objects have a place and words have a tone, when priorities fit inside values without scraping, and when a day, though imperfect, carries the weight of what matters without collapsing under what does not. St. Joseph's workshop carries this geometry in its silence, angles agreeing with purpose, tools resting where they belong, and the hidden strength of joints honoring the grain rather than fighting it. Bodies soften in the presence of such coherence. The nervous system, long recruited by chaos to keep watch, begins to retire from unnecessary posts, and vigilance, so faithful, so tired, finds relief in predictability. Emotional neuroscience would speak of load reducing across circuits designed for threat, allowing attention to widen and memory to retrieve solutions that panic had misplaced. Faith would speak of providence restoring measure, where time is given its right speed and objects are returned to service rather than spectacle. Both are describing a house that can breathe again, a climate in which shame no longer masquerades as motivation and gentleness proves stronger than frenzy. There is a justice in order that often goes unnoticed because it is so humane. When the interior aligns with the exterior, dignity ceases to be borrowed from appearances and begins to rest on truth. Budgets that tell the truth cease to accuse and begin to guide. Calendars that leave margins stop humiliating limitations and begin to honor creaturely rhythms. Rooms that welcome rather than intimidate begin to heal stories that taught the body to brace. The memory of scarcity has many chapters. One by one, order edits them without erasing history, changing the tense of fear from perpetual to past, and teaching the mind that relief can be learned. The carpenter's square appears again as parable. A straight line hidden behind plaster is an act of charity toward everything that will lean on that wall. Shelves, frames, hands reaching for rest. Integrity functions the same way. Choices kept in line with values serve those who will lean on them later, often without knowing who made them or how quietly the decision was carried. St. Joseph's life, almost wordless, becomes a long, steady beam across which generations have rested. In that shadow, a home discovers that order is not primarily aesthetic, it is moral, a way of loving that prevents collapse. In many stories, disorder once disguised itself as freedom, and control once masqueraded as competence. The heart learned to oscillate between the two, exhausted by extremes. The wisdom of Nazareth offers another path, one that refuses both tyranny and drift. It looks ordinary from the outside, a place for the keys, a rhythm for the evenings, a budget that includes beauty without bowing to pressure, conversations that happen before resentment congeals. Ordinary, yet these are the hinges on which peace swings open, the small consistencies that teach a limbic system to stop anticipating fire where there is only supper. Abundance, seen through this lens, is not a warehouse, it is a rule of measure. Enough is not a downgrade from luxury, it is the right fit for a soul that prefers truth over display. When enough is honored, envy loses its script, waste loses its audience, and generosity begins to sound plausible rather than idealistic. The Church's wisdom about the destination of goods reads, "In such a climate, like good housekeeping for the human heart, what is held is entrusted. What is entrusted seeks purpose. What finds purpose becomes joy." With St. Joseph, every work becomes a prayer, and order prayed this way turns every room into a keeper of hope. The body keeps score of this hope with small, faithful signals. Sleep becomes less combative, appetite less anxious, and breath less interrupted by imaginary alarms. The prefrontal regions, relieved of constant firefighting, begin to plan with mercy rather than with fear, and imagination, no longer hired by catastrophe, returns to its rightful craft of possibility. Words follow suit. Yes means yes, without resentment attached to its ankle, and no means no without the shrillness of panic. This coherence is not a performance, it is recovery. There is tenderness in how memory behaves. When order grows patient roots, objects become sacramental, aprons that recall meals where laughter returned, ledgers that recall a season when the account was small and courage was large, a modest lamp that recalls nights when someone waited up until the last pair of footsteps came home. Nothing flamboyant, everything specific. Grace is fond of specifics, and order, when it is mercy, makes room for such visitations. In the school of St. Joseph, details are not trivial, they are places where fidelity chooses to live. The refrain that has accompanied this hour belongs here as well, because repetition is how both neurons and souls learn to trust. St. Joseph, silent guardian, intercede for us. Spoken in rooms that are still learning their shape, it carries the promise that alignment is possible, that angles can be corrected without shaming the hands that drew them, and that the God who enters houses through ordinary doors is not impatient with slow craftsmanship. The table hears it, the ledger hears it, the hallway lined with shoes hears it, and a home thickens around the sound. And when order has settled like a good foundation, love stops tripping on the threshold. It can move freely through the rooms it inhabits, blessing without dramatics, repairing without speeches, staying without spectacle. The candle on the table burns steadier, the bread tastes more like peace than like proof, and the square of the carpenter, resting where it belongs, seems to shine with the quiet truth it has always preached. Alignment is mercy, and mercy is abundance in its most reliable form. In this geometry, a family finds not display but durability, and durability is what storms respect. There comes a moment in every house when a line reveals itself as slightly off, not disastrous, not fatal, just off by the kind of fraction that, left alone, will twist weight into the future. The heart recognizes this as a moral geometry, a quiet misalignment between what is cherished and what is repeated, between what is promised and what is practiced. Shame often rushes in at such moments and tries to turn a measurement into a verdict, yet grace prefers another path. Grace notices, names, and then stands beside as if to say that a small correction in time is mercy for years to come. St. Joseph's workshop holds space for this gentleness, where a beam is lifted just enough for truth to enter and where strength returns, not with noise but with accuracy. Bodies know the relief of correction when it is delivered without humiliation. Emotional neuroscience observes how systems built for prediction relax when a better pattern arrives, and how the brain registers a right line as safety because fewer surprises will follow. Prediction errors, once constant, begin to decline. The amygdala's lantern dims. Prefrontal clarity finds room again to place judgment where panic had parked itself. The soul describes the same experience with older words. Repentance felt as oxygen, conversion felt as alignment, the quiet joy of seeing a path straighten underfoot. In this place, the past is allowed to be past without losing its lessons, and the future is permitted to be new without demanding amnesia. Realignment carries a sound, not the crash of demolition, but the steady tap of careful hands coaxing stubborn material into honesty. Wood receives such persuasion with patience when pressure is right, firm, not harsh, exact, not cruel, and a home receives it the same way. The correction that lasts does not insult the material, it respects the grain. When a house remembers this, narratives of failure become stories of fidelity, and dignity returns to the surface like a figure worked slowly out of stone. The eyes soften, the jaw releases, and the breath, which had been budgeting itself as if oxygen were scarce, begins to spend more freely. There is a theology in this craftsmanship. Providence, far from being an excuse for passivity, is the assurance that honest adjustments matter because someone accompanies them. Daily bread is not only provision, it is the pace at which change is digested without harming the heart. In the school of St. Joseph, this pace becomes a blessing, not sudden spectacle that overwhelms the nervous system, but steady grace that the body can believe. What is repeated with love becomes the new default, and default is where futures are built. Memories often protest in the language of inevitability, insisting that the old angle is the only possible angle because it has been there so long. Yet memory is more pliable than fear admits. Neuroplasticity continues its quiet labor into late years, stitching new roads through landscapes that believed themselves fixed. The saints bore witness to this before science named it, living proofs that habits can be taught and retaught until the soul recognizes itself under a better light. St. Joseph's silence testifies to the same, transformation that does not sell tickets or write press releases, yet outlives both. Some truths arrive with weight because love refuses to flatter where integrity is at stake. Waste remains expensive even when hidden. Evasion remains corrosive even when polite. Resentment remains a thief even when justified. Compassion does not dilute these truths. Compassion carries them in hands that refuse to drop what is precious while insisting that what harms cannot remain. Under such hands, corrections lose their threat and become gifts. Integrity, like a concealed mortise joint, holds more than is visible and protects more than will ever thank it by name. Money, when realigned, resumes its vocation as servant rather than judge. Ledgers stop acting like mirrors of worth and begin to function as maps of meaning. The smallest surplus can taste like freedom when it is not asked to impersonate identity. The Church's wisdom about the destination of goods grows practical under this light. What is entrusted seeks purpose, and purpose awakens joy. With St. Joseph, Every work becomes a prayer, and even the arithmetic of a modest month begins to sound like gratitude spoken in numbers. Relationships, too, reveal their angles under gentle light. Sentences that once slipped toward defense learn to pause where listening lives. Glances that once calculated distance relearn approach. Apologies regain the art of being brave without becoming theatrical. The nervous system records these micro-corrections as safety and over time stops ringing alarms at the first creak of memory. Houses that live through such seasons begin to carry a new resonance in their walls, as if laughter had been absorbed into the timber and could be returned on request. Realignment does not erase the marks of earlier angles. It consecrates them. The line once off becomes part of the testimony a home tells without speaking. Here is where fear tried to draw the plan. Here is where love took the pencil back. The carpenter's square resting on the bench looks almost sacramental in such moments, a promise that geometry remains a friend of grace and that truth, measured kindly, saves material and souls alike. St. Joseph, silent guardian, intercede for us. The refrain repeats because repetition is how both neurons and hearts become trustworthy again. When the correction settles, abundance changes timbre. It sounds less like relief from catastrophe and more like confidence in ordinary days. Chairs scrape the floor with the modest dignity of things that belong. Bread is cut with the unhurried care of hands that know they are guided, and evening arrives without ambush. In that light, a home recognizes its vocation again, not to impress, not to perform, but to hold. And holding, under the patience of God and the patronage of Joseph, is a rich word. There is a rhythm to mercy that homes begin to recognize the way lungs recognize air, a cadence that refuses panic's tempo and teaches the body to prefer sufficiency over spectacle. Daily bread carries that rhythm in its very name, inviting a heart that once hurried through mornings and braced for nights to inhabit time without bargaining against it. Emotional neuroscience notices how predictability, when it is kind, gives the nervous system room to stand down from false alarms, and how memories, once recruited for catastrophe, start lending themselves to perspective. Faith notices the same with older language, naming providence as the presence that fits the hour, neither late nor loud, but exact in a way that restores trust. In the school of St. Joseph, this pace becomes the atmosphere in which a house stops performing survival and starts living again. The square on the bench returns as parable. Measure, mark, and then let the cut follow the truth already drawn. There is no need to rush a line that will hold the weight of a family. When days shift into this steadiness, even small meals feel taller, and conversations that once frayed at the edges find enough fabric to finish the seam. A home learns the art of thresholds, the first light that enters a kitchen, the last lamp that is turned off, and in these modest sacraments, time itself seems to bless those who dwell within it. St. Joseph, silent guardian, intercede for us. Glorious St. Joseph, spouse of Mary and virginal father of Jesus, guardian of silence and steady provider of Nazareth, receive this house and the hearts that live within its rooms. In your shadow, fear loses its script, and work recovers its dignity, and under your gaze the ordinary is honored until it shines. Obtain for this home the abundance that does not shout, peace that returns after long absence, order that protects without controlling, dignified labor that does not devour, prudence in finances that tells the truth without shaming, health of body and mind that allows love to stand upright, and the bread of each day shared without fear. Deliver what harms, waste that steals, resentment that corrodes, secrecy that isolates, noise that drowns listening, and let truth sit comfortably at the table. Teach hands to bless before they divide, teach words to heal before they explain, teach eyes to meet without flinching. Make every task a prayer and every prayer a companionship that changes the weight of what must be carried. Bless the door that welcomes and the threshold that protects. Bless the rooms that hold rest and the corners that hold memories. Bless the ledger that guides choices and the pantry that receives providence. St. Joseph, terror of demons and comfort of the afflicted, place this family beneath your mantle. Align what is misaligned, steady what trembles, guard what is fragile. May the presence of God dwell here in quiet strength, so that fatigue does not have the final voice, and so that hope does not misplace its keys. St. Joseph, silent guardian, intercede for us. Amen. There was a season when this house learned the sound of scarcity, the way a roof learns the sound of rain, constant, insistent, wearing, and laughter when it came felt like a visitor unsure of its welcome. The account was thin, tempers thinner, and the future often arrived disguised as a question no one could answer. Yet a different story began in small ways that did not look like a rescue so much as a reweaving, a repair done instead of replaced, saved what little could be saved. A conversation ended without the usual fracture and left behind a silence that was gentler than expected. An opportunity appeared that did not promise the world, only the next right step, and the next step proved enough. Bodies noticed before minds caught up, shoulders lowered by degrees, sleep stopped negotiating for permission, and the eyes, once always measuring distance, learned to rest on faces again. The ledger still needed care, yet it ceased to be a mirror of worth. The table still knew restraint, yet it tasted of gratitude more than of proof. The rooms still held history, yet history began to bless as often as it warned. No headline announced the change, but visitors commented on the air, and those who lived here felt the timbre of days deepen. With St. Joseph, every work becomes a prayer, and quiet providence wrote its witness into wood and bread, into budgets and bedtime, until even memory, so certain of its old plot, began to tell the story with a softer voice. When storms lessen and routines return, a subtle temptation visits, to forget who remained. Yet the deepest blessing of a house like this is precisely that it learns to remain through lean months and small feasts, through aching evenings and ordinary mornings, until fidelity itself becomes the fragrance in the rooms. Remaining does not mean standing still, it means holding true. The carpenter's square resting where it belongs feels like a benediction in such light, a quiet proclamation that alignment is mercy, and mercy is strong enough for years. Emotional memory, once trained to anticipate loss, begins to anticipate presence, and the nervous system, grateful for the proof, releases the last of the alarms it kept just in case. Faith names this shift with joy. God has visited his people, not in spectacle but in nearness, not in avoidance of limits but in companionship within them. The candle on the table burns with a steadier flame. The loaf, even when modest, tastes of enough. The rooms, however simple, carry the dignity of a sanctuary that needs no audience to be real. In the school of St. Joseph, this is how abundance sounds at the end of a day. Chairs drawn close without drama, breath at ease without permission, gratitude spoken without performance. St. Joseph, silent guardian, intercede for us. And may the God who measures out days with wisdom keep watch through the night, so that those who sleep here rise to the work of love with rested hearts and hands that remember the craft of hope.